back on the red Ram Roadster today, my 24 Dodge Brothers hot rod. I see I got the 241 Hemi engine pulled back out of the car. When I went to open up the 37 Cadillac LaSalle trans to inspect and clean, I noticed it had a couple of chipped teeth on some of the gears, which is fairly common on those transmissions, more so the first and reverse gear cluster. So until I hunt down the parts for that, I have a backup trans, a 37 Packard 3-speed manual trans, which is comparable for durability to that LaSalle transmission. I do have an adapter for the Packard trans as well that I hunted down over time. So today we're going to swap that in. We got to take off the adapter here, split this two pieces apart so I can put the flywheel on that I had cut, get that mounted, get the Packard adapter mounted to this with the new clutch disc and pressure plate that I had resurfaced. We got a few other seals to install, and then we'll put this back together as an assembly and put the motor and trans back into the car. Also, I'm going to be changing up the engine crossmember mount, so we got to do that as well. So a little step backward, but in the end it'll be a positive step forward. So let's get some tools out and start on it. So we got the flywheel fitted, and it only goes on one way because these two bolts are offset as far as the spacing. It's not equal all the way around. This way it ensures that it goes on in the exact position that's needed. So next I will get the nuts threaded onto the backside. I'll put some red Loctite on, get them torqued up, and then we will get the clutch pressure plate and disc installed. And then at that point we can get this adapter for the Packard transmission buttoned up. So now that we got the flywheel securely bolted to the crank, next we need to install the bronze pilot bushing into the back of the crank that the transmission input shaft rides on right there. I had this piece custom machined as the Packard transmission was 1 inch shorter than the Cadillac LaSalle trans. So I had to have it machined with an extension on it. So I have it in the freezer right now to shrink it slightly because it is a pressed fit. So let's go to the freezer, grab the bushing, and install it. There we go. So the smaller piece is the part that gets pressed into the back of the crank, and this is the extended end that the Packard transmission slides into. So let's get that installed. There it is. It's looking real nice. This material is called the oilite bronze. It's impregnated with oil, so it's constantly lubricating the shaft of the transmission. So next we will get the pressure plate and clutch disc installed, and then at that point we can bolt up that Packard transmission. Well, I ran into a bit of a problem, a little bit of an error on my part. The clutch disc here. So as I was saying, the larger diameter I had machined on the extended part of the pilot bushing is too large of a diameter to fit through the center of the clutch disc. This pilot bushing is a standard one for a Hemi transmission and even the Cadillac LaSalle, but you can see how it's about an inch in length, and the Packard trans is an inch shorter, the shaft, so I had an inch extension machined out of a new piece to make this twice as long. What I should have had him do was machine the full 2 inches this diameter, so it fits through there. So now I got to get that out, and as you saw, that was a pressed fit, but there's a little trick to it to help me get it out. I started doing it now. I stuffed the center of this bore with some bread. Yep, just good old white bread. You can use rye, you can use whole wheat, whatever you want. You can also use grease. What it's doing is it's filling that void, and it's going to push from the back side, push that bushing out. I got a punch here, just about the exact diameter of that center hole. So as I'm pressing this in, it's going to push that bread behind the bushing, and the bushing has no other way to come out but towards me. So I know you may not believe it, but I'm going to show it to you. Here we go. Now I've filled this a few times and I've already packed it in tight. There's physics and science behind this. Let's see if it actually works. It's coming. Pack some more bread in there. Tastes good too. All right. Just about got it. Put some more bread in there. There it is. It actually worked. Now I just got to dig the bread out of that end of the crankshaft hole. But you can see here I need to get this machine down to this diameter. No big deal. I'll take it to the local machine shop tomorrow and have it done. Then we'll reinstall it and continue on. There's the bread. Just to give you a better idea of what I'm talking about and show you a visual of how this goes together. This is the clutch disc. You can see the splines which match up to the input shaft. This part here is what rides in the pilot bushing, like that. Well, I had it like this, but you can see this was too large. It's there. So this slides onto the shaft. And then how I had it was like that. And you can see when the clutch is pressed and it slides forward to it engages, it actually hits that, and it can't fully travel the full distance to make contact with the flywheel. So I'll have this machined all the way down to the smaller diameter. So imagine if we had it like that, but it was that long, 2 inches. When the clutch is pushed, it now clears that bushing. Also, when I go to put the clutch together, this tool here replicates the input shaft of that Packard transmission. So I can line up the clutch disc inside the pressure plate. Bolt up the pressure plate with this sandwich between it and the flywheel. Once it's bolt tight, I can pull that out and the clutch disc will stay in its position. So when I go to bolt the transmission up to the bell housing, this is already going to be centered and this is centered, so it should slide right in. But we'll get to that later on. So we last left off with the pilot bushing dilemma. So I took it to the local machine shop and had them turn it down to what I need. Give you a close-up. So this area right here, I had them turned down to a smaller diameter. So I just took it out of the freezer. I'll get it pressed into the back of the crank, and then we can continue on where we last left off. So the end of that is chamfered, so it kind of self-centers itself to get started. Now I'll just get my bushing installer to fit. And we'll lightly tap that into the end of the crank. All right, that worked perfect. Again, with putting it in the freezer, help shrink that bushing ever so slightly to ease it going into the end of that crank. All right, next we'll be installing the new clutch disc and the pressure plate. Basically, this clutch disc has a flywheel side, which is marked here, so it would be installed this way. You can see how the clutch engages the flywheel, which gives you your power from the engine to the trans. So this basically gets sandwiched in between the flywheel and the pressure plate. It needs to be put on as an assembly. And I have this, I call it a clutch alignment tool, which takes place of the input shaft of the transmission to help align it while assembly is being done. You can see here that will slide through there and into that new pilot bushing. I had to have this custom machined down to the diameter of the Packard trans to fit the pilot bushing. A Packard piece is not readily available. This actually is from a Chevy 350 that I had modified to work for my application. So that's all part of hot rodding, customizing, making things as you need them to work. So that's half the fun of it, I'll tell you. All right, so let's get this up in position with the pressure plate. I've cleaned both surfaces, so they are prepped and ready to go in. I'm going to get a couple bolts started in this just to get it up there, and then slide the clutch disc in between. It's got a little weight to it, so anything to help get started. All right. So we'll slip this in between, making sure I have the right side. Yes, flywheel side. So now I'll use the clutch alignment tool, feed it through the splines of the clutch disc, and then center it into the pilot bushing. Because once I lock this pressure plate in, the springs in here are going to push up against that disc and it's going to be engaged. So there's no wiggle room with it once I have this all bolted in. And then to try and get the transmission up there and slide it in position without it being aligned, it'll never happen. So this ensures the easy installation of the transmission, hopefully. All right, so we got that in. I'm going to put the rest of the bolts in. I'm going to put some blue Loctite on them and then get them tightened down and torqued. And then after that, we'll go ahead and get the second half of the adapter housing on for the transmission. Okay, so you saw me bolting up the pressure plate, got all the bolts torqued. Now we can take out that clutch alignment tool. You can see it in there, how it lines up the clutch disc and centers it in relation to that pilot bushing we pressed in. So we can take that out. You can see in there the pilot bushing, and the clutch disc is now centered around it. And you can see how important this clutch alignment tool is, as it replicates the input shaft of the transmission. So these splines here are the splines here, and then the part that rides on that pilot bushing is right there. So this way, when we go to put this transmission back in, they'll line right up and go right into the splines and into that bushing. No problem. So next we'll take the second half of that transmission adapter, get that bolted up to the parameter of that one. And then after that, we'll get the bell housing for the Packard trans bolted up, and then the trans itself. Moving right along here. All right, now that we got those two adapters bolted up, we got one more. Basically, it's the bell housing for the Packard transmission. This is an Offenhauser part 3641. But before I bolt that up to there, I'm going to take it over to the bench. I got a new seal to press in and also the throw out bearing. So I'll meet you over at the workbench. All right, back at the bench we are. A couple of things. One thing I've already done was, you can see this linkage rod here to actuate the clutch, the throwout bearing. Originally this was up here all the way, but for my application it would work to my advantage to have it down here for the linkage once I make for the clutch pedal and the clutch rod linkage. So what I did was I drilled out the retainer pin, pulled it out, and basically flipped this upside down, so now it points down. So now I can still get the full travel of that clutch fork. And now that we're on the inside here, this is the bearing retainer that the throwout bearing rides on, that actuates the fingers of the pressure plate for the clutch. So this is a new piece, basically, that rides on there. So with this 37 Packard trans adapting to an early Hemi, I had to take this bearing retainer. This is from I think a 39 Ford that I used, bolted to the inside of the bell housing. Normally this would bolt to the front of the transmission, but this is a unique scenario that we're doing here. So I got that done. What I'll do now is go ahead and get the new, well, before that, let's get this seal pressed in, right into there it goes. What this seal does, as the input shaft of the transmission rides through here, there's a lip seal that keeps any gear oil from going on to the clutch. So this was a little tricky because I had to get a measurement of this outer diameter and then the outer diameter of the transmission shaft, and look through different catalogs and find the size I need. I can't just call up and order for this application because it really doesn't exist. What I'm doing here is not a standard thing. So again, it's all going back to hot rodding and customizing and having fun with it. So let's get that pressed into there. So I just have a large socket that fits that diameter, and I'll get that lightly hammered into position. Okay, so you can see that seal is now pressed in. I'll put a little gear oil on that rubber lip to help lubricate it for when the shaft goes in there from the transmission. Now we'll flip it over and get that new throwout bearing installed. There's a return spring right here that aids in pulling this back when you actuate the clutch pedal. So this slides onto here. Actually, I'm going to put a little oil on that. We got our clutch fork. A bearing. Get that spring, return spring attached to So you can see when I'm stepping on the clutch pedal, the linkage activates this rod, and you can see that throwout bearing, which would be engaging the clutch. So now that we have all that installed, we can now put this onto the engine, onto the other adapters we have already bolted up. All right, the final piece, somewhat. You can see here there's alignment dowel pins on each side, which center this bell housing onto this adapter. We don't really want to rely on the weight on just those bolts. So those dowel pins serve a great purpose. So let's get those set on. Get a few bolts started. Just work our way around and get that tidied up, and then we'll get the transmission on. All right, time to get this 37 Packard trans put into the bell housing here and the adapters we have for the Hemi engine. Just going to put a light coat of gear oil on the input shaft. As well as that seal that we pressed in earlier. All right, let's get this into position. There we go. Can you imagine in a normal car doing this inside the car? It's a little tricky. I mean, it's challenging enough doing it outside of the car. All right, we got the bolts started. Just tighten them up and that'll complete the assembly of the engine and clutch and trans. So now that we have everything together, we're just going to final check it by spinning the crankshaft up front. And when I do that, this tail shaft should spin because I do have the transmission engaged in gear right now internally. So let's see what happens. Oh yeah, there it goes. We're spinning. So everything worked out as planned. So the splines have matched up, everything bolted up nice, clutch is lined up and engaging. What we'll be doing next is putting this engine and trans assembly back into the hot rod. I currently have the shifter top plate off so I can slide it in and out of the car easily. But this is the top shifter plate we'll be putting back on once the engine's back in the car. So very happy with how this is turning out. We had a bad situation of the Cadillac LaSalle trans having some chipped teeth, and we turned it into a positive thing by making use of this 37 Packard trans that I happen to have. So it's actually a little bit cooler, I think, because you don't see these as often in hot rods as the LaSalle transmissions. Even back in the day, it was it was done, but it wasn't as common as the Cadillac. So I'm kind of happy I'm running the Packard trans now. So something different, which I like. This whole car is different. I mean, it's a 24 Dodge Brothers Roadster with a early Hemi in it, with the Packard 3-speed trans, 46 Ford rear banjo, rear axle assembly. So it's definitely one of a kind. So what we'll be doing next is taking this engine and trans assembly and getting it back into the hot rod. So yeah, check back in for the next video, and that's what we'll be doing. Thanks for watching, and consider a subscription if you haven't already subscribed, and we'll see you next time.